Welcome everybody to the second event of our 2024-2025 TMU DAS lecture series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dustin Valen. I'm a faculty member here, and I am co-chair this year together with Jennifer Esposito of our lecture series committee. If this is your first time visiting the lecture series, welcome. Please know that this is the second event of 6 lectures, exciting lectures that we have lined up by award-winning practitioners, authors, and thinkers. And these will take place, this is our last lecture for the fall, but we have a whole bunch more coming up in the winter. Now, our last lecture ended up being postponed. We'll be in communication with you real soon about the rebooking of that. That's also going to take place in the winter. So clear your schedules. It's going to be a busy winter lecture series. In the meantime, do take notice of the posters that are up all over the school. Mark your calendars with those dates. It's really an opportunity for the whole school to come together when we have these lectures. So we like to see a full house. Now, before I get started, I do want to thank our sponsors for the lecture series. We are extremely grateful to have the support of the Ontario Association of Architects, ERA Architects, Thames Valley Brick and Tile, Merrant Construction, Sense Engineering, BDP Quadrangle, and Shop 3D. Without these sponsors, there would be absolutely no lecture series whatsoever. So I can't emphasize enough how thankful we are to all of them and for their support. I also want to thank our fantastic administrative team that helps us enormously in putting these things together. Alexandra Bercianu, Francisco Bianchi, and Alin Serino, all of whom helped us in both promoting and organizing a lot of the back of house material that happens for each lecturer that comes in. Of course, I want to thank our student volunteers, too, for being a part of this year's lecture series committee. There are now too many of them to name, and the group is growing all the time, which is fantastic. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to one of our student volunteers, Giselle Ortega-Joseph, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker for us and offer a land acknowledgement on behalf of the school and our university community. We should also note that there is a competing event at the Rogers Center tonight. So perhaps that's where people are. So if they're the Swifties, I guess we're the Northies? Can that be our thing? Be quite the title. Sorry, there you go, Giselle.
Thank you. Good evening, Northies. And thank you for joining us tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on traditional territory known as the Dish with One Spoon. This is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee, symbolizing a commitment to share and protect the land in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As architects and designers, we understand deeply the impact of our work and what it has on this land and its history. We are grateful to honor these values here today. Tonight's event holds a special significance as it is dedicated to the memory of former faculty member Margery Winkler. Margery was a landscape architect and professor in the Department of Architectural Science here at TMU from the years of 1982 until 2009. She left an enduring legacy through her commitment to community-based design, her inspiring dedication to teaching, and her passion for fostering student creativity. Among her many contributions, Margery created and led the department's first collaborative exercise, encouraging students to partner with local youth to design bird habitats from recycled materials. She championed sustainability in both education and practice, directing the RU Green Sustainable Open Space Design Competition and transforming local high schools in collaboration with Canada Blooms. Margery's influence extended well beyond our department, and her memory lives on through her work and through her family. We're honored to have her family here tonight. We are honored to welcome tonight's featured speakers, Alissa and Pete North, co-directors of North Design Office, founded in 2005. North Design Office is a highly regarded Ontario-based landscape architecture practice known for its environmental commitment and creative vision. Their portfolio spans city parks, master plans, private residences, and public installations, all celebrated for their environmental ethos and artistic sensibility. The office has received numerous awards in international design competitions, and their built projects and art installations have been widely published. Alissa and Pete are both graduates of the University of Toronto's Bachelor of Landscape Architecture program and holders of a Master's in Landscape Architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. It brings not only deep professional expertise, but also a shared commitment to education, as they both serve as professors in landscape architecture program at the University of Toronto. Their approach to design, combining ecological responsibility with artistic exploration, aligns closely with Margery Winkler's legacy of community-focused, sustainable design. We are thrilled to welcome them tonight to share their insights and experience with us. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks everyone for having us here tonight. No need for, I guess, an introduction, but you want to, before we start, Pete North and Alissa.
I just thought I'd show my face. We're going to kind of swap back and forth, so then it won't be odd when you suddenly see a new person coming. So I'm going to have a seat, and
Okay.
then Pete's going to.
Okay. So tonight we were asked to sort of dig deep a little bit into some archives and some older work and try to trace a trajectory of our work over the years. So it's been kind of fun putting this together. We'll start with sort of smaller installation work that we're both really passionate about, and then we'll move through some of our public work, and then through finishing up with some of our research and work at U of T in the Department of Landscape Architecture, Daniel's faculty. So I will get started here. So to start with our practice, North Design Office, founded in 2005. So we've been at it for a little while, starting with a group of installations that for us really, I think important to me in terms of starting our thinking about responding to site. And this for us is what is I think really fun. The most fun is sort of looking for answers in the site and seeing if you can connect strongly in terms of experiential through that tracing. So the first project was at the Jardin de Métis at International Garden Festival in the Gaspé Peninsula. And the garden was Core Sample is the name of the garden. And it was built from an understanding of the Gaspé Peninsula. If anyone's been out there before, it's a beautiful undulating topography that we were looking at the surrounding landscape, trying to make trying to make a connection to that. And then also looking at alignments from solstice alignments and to the greater picture beyond the site. So with that, we started to look at our feet, in essence, look down at the ground, look out at the landscape, and draw these connections. So Core Sample really is about making connections to larger sort of geological movements within the landscape, and then looking closely at beautiful found objects that surround the site as well. So Core Sample is about digging down deep, looking out big, and then bringing that into close proximity in these samples that would allow you to sort of wander through and see them in closer detail. So that was the first project way back when that sort of started our thinking and connecting to sites in a sort of short term. These projects in the Gaspé Peninsula would last about this was 2 years, iterations, and it would change slightly over the years, but they're temporary installations where you can really test ideas and research materials, etc. The next installation, also a temporary installation, was for it's Cleveland Public Art, and it was for historic Mall B in downtown Cleveland. We were invited to submit an idea for this competition, and to that point, I didn't know too much about Cleveland, to be honest. I didn't know how to get there. I knew a little bit about the history, that it was at one point, I think the river maybe caught fire because of some contamination issues, but I didn't know a whole lot about the city. So when we first went down there, I was really surprised. It's really, really beautiful. There's beautiful architecture. And it was growing and changing in a way that they were really concerned with sort of new and innovative green technologies. Young professionals were moving to the downtown core and really surprised with what Cleveland had to offer. So that we responded to that in a way that was pointing to the new future of Cleveland and looking at the new and innovative green technologies that they were researching and developing and within Cleveland, and tried to draw attention to that. So Mall B is a beautiful, clean, open lawn in the downtown Cleveland, where if you remember, President Obama, is one of his sort of not his no, it wasn't his inauguration. One of the rallies was held there. So tens of thousands of people were there. So that's the site. But after hours, it was dark and unsafe, and it was sort of underutilized. So we wanted to bring people to the site after hours. We wanted to mark this transition into a new future for Cleveland and really animate this space that was otherwise underutilized most of the time. So these were translucent film coverings, these tensile fabrics over these objects that were sort of marching towards a green future. They were solar panels that were put over top of them that would gather energy throughout the day and emit this glow in the evening, sort of inviting people down to the site. Within that, we had planted strips of native prairie grasses, native Ohio prairie grasses that would serve to sort of kickstart this urban ecology as well. So these were situated within that. And it was pretty cool to see that in the first few minutes, in fact, or first afternoon of planting these grasses, birds started to arrive and a lot of urban critters started to arrive on site once those were put in place. We were concerned with temporary installations. We're often concerned with, where do they go after 2 years or 3 years? And we often like to see a future for these projects, not just going to sort of recycling or what's the next phase for them. So with this project, it moved to Quebec after Cleveland, and we entitled it the Itinerant Pod. So they continue to move from site to site. They have this sort of new presence within a lupin field, which is this beautiful flowing field in the Jardin de Métis. They were there for a few days, and then they moved, or for a few summers rather, and then they were moved to downtown Montreal and are back. So that it was meant to be nimble and be able to sort of be packed up and take on new characters and new uses elsewhere within Quebec in this case. The last installation we'll touch on here is celebrating 100 years of parks in the city of Calgary. We were invited in this case to put forth an idea to rethink or reoccupy in a way the Olympic Plaza, which in a way was being underutilized, and I think it's being redesigned as we speak through a design competition. But this was a year or two short-term installation, and it was for, if you've been to Calgary, they have the Center Plaza. It was for the '88 Olympic Games, and this water feature sat in the center. This was the site that we were given. We called it Big Sky, and Big Sky, when we first arrived on site, we looked around and said, okay, what are we going to do in this space? And for those of you that know Calgary, the sky is forever changing. It's spectacular. We brought that to the site with this reflection. So the pixelated ground plane references the moving sky above. And then within that, we were looking at all of the different systems that would flow from the Rocky Mountains through the city and reflecting that in the water. So when it was filled with water, you'd have this reflection of the sky. You would have the layer of moving ecologies through the city. And then when the water was drained, which it often would be throughout the summer for events that maybe would sprawl into the open plaza, we wanted it to be interactive as well. So we wanted kids to be able to sit and play with them. So it was an interactive feature as well. So it had to be robust enough to take on all these things. But basically just bringing all of the energies that surround the downtown core to the site in the center of the city. So a snapshot of some of the installations that that we love to do, various scales, and the next sort of phase or the next line of thinking is in residence. So in our office, we do installation work, we do residential design, we do public spaces, and so residences for us or residential design, we are concerned again with finding the answer in the site, looking to the site for inspiration and connecting to natural systems, the use of native vegetation when we can, things that are that thrive and work well in each site, but often through the lens of a modern aesthetic. So taking native vegetation and using that to simply connect to the natural process on the site. So this is a residential design that was along a ravine in Toronto. So the TRCA was quite strict in terms of what the plant palette could be. And it was a spectacular ravine as well. So we wanted a sort of a minimal intervention that would allow that natural system to be legible, allow that ravine to be sort of the main focus, and then our scheme would sort of fit in within that and respect that system as well. So the next one would be small, so that's a mid-scale residential project of which we have lots going on in the office. The next would be sort of smaller scale planting schemes. So this is one that looks at biodiversity. And in our opinion, biodiversity can be at super small scales. It can be at, a small residential scale, and it can be much larger than that also. So for us, it's utilizing beautiful, rich, and complex planting palette, again, of native species and pollinator species that can really activate and animate smaller scale residential designs as well. Pushing that forward into restorations, looking at a formal planting palette, but it's also connecting to natural systems, using pollinator species, but also maybe in a slightly more formal way, and a nod to sort of some of the historic homes within Southern Ontario that we are working on as well. So that's the two sort of smaller scale. We're going to flip to public spaces for the middle portion of this, and then on to schoolwork.
Hi, now it's my turn. And just before I move on, I would like to acknowledge Professor Capellas because I had him when I was a student at U of T. He taught a senior seminar course, and it was like one of those, I'm sure you guys know if you've had him or if you get to look forward to having him, one of those really special professors that you get a few of them, and that was definitely George. So this is that's the beginning of the even before this story. That was part of the story. So just wanted to mention that. So as we move on to public spaces, there's sort of a series of projects here that we're kind of pulling out. We've done a few schoolyard master planning, and here's similar situation where we're trying to figure out what's happening in the schoolyard in terms of maybe an existing condition. In this particular part of the schoolyard, there was a drainage issue. So there was a lot of water that was constantly pooling in the schoolyard. And it would have to be sort of a pretty significant, plumbing situation to work out. We thought, that's something landscape can solve. So we thought in this particular area, we could have all sorts of planters that are essentially working as bioswales, and then kids could be running around in that area. There's also considerations about heat island effect, particularly on schoolyards because of the amount of asphalt that we have. That's typically a Toronto schoolyard. And heat island effect basically hovers at its highest temperature, exactly this height. All kids in public school are about right there. And so that's a really intense condition that they have to be dealing with. And so the idea of greening, the idea of creating these kind of planters that could also be a really fun zone to run around. And then the more typical things that schoolyards need in terms of tracks and basketball fields, and just putting in as many trees as the TDSB allows us to get into there, really greening that entire condition. So thinking about these aspects as something that will, solve an existing condition and really kind of enrich and allow environmental condition to be educational or playful or so forth. Um, Another project that we've done that maybe some of you guys have been to is the stacked container market at the base of Bathurst. This was a contaminated site, and so it's a very temporary idea. It's why it's a container market. And so the landscape was really meant to be sort of fairly inexpensive and temporary as well, so that site will have another future at some point. But in the meantime, it's this idea of sort of animating these spaces, allowing these various spaces to have these compelling activities, and just like the bustling activity, urban life, really simple kind of gestures that allow kind of, activity and program and, a little bit of green here and there for, where it's possible to sort of fit it in based on the soil conditions. Green roofs and courtyards and streetscapes is sort of, come together, particularly in this project at Woodsworth College. And, trying to basically bring those connections through campus, bring greening, see where we can find sort of more potentials for green roofs and so forth. And then the courtyard spaces itself, make those connections between campus where, where previously they were just sort of paved areas and former parking lots. So how can you really bring green into that? And then always trying to pull in the stories. What are the stories about the places? What was there previously? What are those underlying sort of narratives that are happening? And at Dufferin Grove Village, there was a previous river that kind of runs through the particular site. In fact, it's why Dufferin Grove Park is there and why the topography sort of slopes down a little bit there. And there were all sorts of other sort of interesting things that we dug up in terms of, other events and so forth. And so the lines of the pavement are kind of playing with that aspect. But we also thought, even just digging up this site, having to dig up the concrete that's there, having to dig up the asphalt, light posts, other materials, is there some way we could make use of those? And so there was really this idea that started to come in about material salvage, and that would start to form, bench elements or retaining sort of elements and so forth. And so in terms of thinking that through in iterations, the idea that, busted up concrete might be able to fill sort of gabion baskets that then make the planters for street trees, or that, that concrete might be able to start to form these sort of seeding areas and walls that then basically can have sort of more opportunistic vegetation that'll come in and fill in those places. So that, the story of the site, even if the materials are fairly contemporary, it's the new story of the site, but somehow those filter in as well and kind of create something a little bit more interesting. This is the International Estonian Center, which is being built just a little bit east of Spadina and north of Bloor. It's right behind that large sort of brutalist concrete building. And the Estonian community, like many sort of immigrant communities in Toronto, sort of over the years are kind of becoming smaller and smaller. And so they're kind of combining all their resources onto this one site. And so they're putting a new Estonian center there. And because it's on top of the subway condition, it's sort of complicated in terms of what can be done on this site. But the idea of fitting in a few trees and working out this paving pattern made sense sort of on this plane. The pattern itself comes from the architecture and the footprint sort of outline of Estonia itself, that then gets kind of printed onto there. And this one also has a green roof component in it as well. So that's kind of like a private space, and the plaza is meant to be a very public space, those two together. And there's a connection that goes through. A lot of that end of the block is being developed quite intensely. And then this particular kind of courtyard and sort of all the as much greening as you can get in the city of Toronto is taking place, but also in a really meaningful way. The birch tree is a really symbolic tree for the Estonian community, and so a focus on that to sort of really bring that cultural element to it, and then allow just urban vegetation, all the conditions that it takes to flourish. So even to get this small amount of trees on top of a subway track, with every, tree technology available right now to have the right amount of soil volume, even things like that in the city of Toronto become pretty challenging. This is a project, a development project that we're working on, 310 Front Street. And this has kind of gone through a few iterations. So here it was originally meant to be really, really topographical. And again, this is another multiple parking garage that exists underneath. So it's a soil building exercise to try and get as many trees to grow as possible. But the first iteration of the building was very sort of glass based. And so the idea that this like Canadian granite is kind of building up from there. And even thinking of urban layers like sort of asphalt materials and that these would sort of play out in the paving pattern. Then the building completely changed in another sort of city revision exercise, and it became this very sort of like New York, power kind of building, and its lines and its color and material. And so we really wanted to play with this idea of this sort of like very business, like town type building, but not only like the power man, but also like the power woman. So kind of playing with that in terms of these stripes that play out, and these kind of these are going to be the trees now are sort of in planters that have these sort of beautiful shapely forms that are sort of pulled from the high heel. On this particular project, again, like every project, we're always thinking, what are the components where we can be salvaging materials or bringing sort of more opportunities for green infrastructure. And in this building, the existing building, and the current plaza paving, that all needs to be torn up anyways. We've sort of been working with the company that's going to be doing the demolition on this to really be calculating how much granite we have so that we can be reusing as much of that in the plaza as possible. So that striping pattern is kind of also taking into consideration what the existing materials are. This is a project from the McMichael Gallery, and it's sort of this originally a pathway project that was just going to be really like, what's the closest point A to B to get from the gallery to the Group of Seven cemetery. And I've been going up to the Kleinberg Gallery up there at the McMichael Gallery since probably I was younger than my son who's running across the bridge here. But yeah, probably since I was 4 or 5, and had gone multiple times. And I actually never knew that the Group of Seven cemetery existed on the site because it was sort of a little bit off to the side. And I tended to follow the paths that then went down into the ravine. And so the goal here was to make that connection a lot more clear and a lot more apparent. So it's sort of started as this idea of just a really direct line, and then which you see a bit more on the plan, just this sort of gentle, simple curve, and then a bridge that makes a connection over a swale that was fun and exciting to design, and just really tries to sort of make use of the existing mature trees that are on the site and really allow those to be part of the experience. But at the time, there was also a condition that they were really concerned about at the McMichael Gallery, is that when the McMichaels had first bought the property, like most people did on Ontario farms when they were sort of replanting them from farmland to bring them back to a natural condition, they tended to just plant them in uniform pine trees. So all the trees were the same age, they were pretty much the same species, and they were all starting to fall in decline at the same time. So the idea behind this project was to start to build understory layers and a differentiation in tree species and tree age, as well as a complete sort of replanting of an understory that had just been mown for a really, really long time. So bringing in a completely new kind of ecology, but still thinking about the local materials and thinking about these sort of Canadiana materials as well that would make a lot of sense with the McMichael Gallery. So like rough hewn cedar and Ontario granite, just to sort of make sure that, you know, the narrative of all of that made sense. And then just a ton of planting that really allowed native plant reintroduction. That was so fantastic. I mean, to get into this much plant material and native vegetation that we're sort of losing in Southern Ontario, things that we don't see as often. And again, all fantastic for pollinators and so forth. And then I actually even went in and did quite a bit of education to the maintenance people on the site, because they kind of didn't understand that they wouldn't have to keep mowing this. So there was one area that got mown over. Luckily, the plants rebounded and came back. And then there was concern about snakes and mice and all sorts of things. And I had to sort of explain, like, these are great things. Like, that means it's a healthy ecology. These things are showing up. Your children are going to thank you, all of this. And then one fellow even came up to me at the end and was like, he almost didn't want to say it in front of the other crew, but he was like, you know, I have young kids too, and I'm really glad that you're working on this kind of stuff. So really gratifying in that sense. Really interesting opportunity to do natural infrastructure here. So on the left is like a bioswale that collects all the water that's coming sheet draining over the parking lot. And collecting that and filtering it before it goes down and into the Humber River. And then that's sort of, again, the sort of richness of the planting that's able to take place in that bioswale. Part of this project as well was in a separate area, but kind of part of the overall master planning that we were thinking about, was this mound for Indigenous ceremony. And so the McMichael has First Nations communities that they work with quite specifically. So they worked on the planting area, and for us, it was really about sort of getting the grading and siting it and making sure like the alignments were working. And then they came in and did a community plant on that. So it was a really nice sort of another layer addition onto this project that was quite beautiful. I think this is the last project that I'm going to be speaking about before we move into the next category. And this one is a development project, Dundas Street West. And again, really trying to mine kind of the context and the history, understanding of the site. So this is very close to High Park. The Black Oak Savanna in High Park is a really predominant ecology of that area. The whole neighborhood has fantastic, really large scale oak trees, you know, up to a net, and, you know, sort of all through out and around High Park is pretty fantastic. And so we kind of really wanted to try and bring that character to the site, that this part, knowing that this park basically then would also be a community park, not just for the development itself. So really trying to bring that layer in, but also digging into interesting alignments, another creek that had run through here, so the oak tree, and then also what was on the site previously in terms of industrial heritage and kind of picking up on those alignments. So the current city grid, the industrial heritage, and, you know, we're always doing this kind of research, really sort of finding, you know, that sequence of historic maps to really see sort of how the site changed over time, and anything we can do in terms of archival photographs to kind of really dig into that and understand what happened there, what types of industries. And so there was, you know, milling and so forth, and all those kind of elements come into play in the plan. So now in terms of research, Pete and I have kind of our separate research components, and I'll kind of move through this and just be mindful of time on this. My research kind of falls into the category of publication. Practice is sort of part of that publication primarily, and whether it's sort of on case study based things or whether it's sort of student work falls into that. So these are two books. Operative Landscapes is sort of a case study book that really looks at how landscapes change over time because of how communities get invested in them and how they're involved in them. And then Innate Terrain came out, I think it was just last year, although I've been working on it forever. And so I'm really, really passionate, as is Professor Capellas, about, what is it about us as Canadians and the work that we do that makes that work specifically Canadian. So Innate Terrain is really like trying to do this cross Canada sweep of what's happening in contemporary landscape architecture, Canadian landscape architecture, and really trying to sort of get each author to pull out, like, what is it? What is it about our work that, makes it uniquely Canadian? I don't know if we came up with any specific answers, but it's really sort of fun. And then sort of research work in related to natural infrastructure, Indigenous knowledge. This was a fantastic study. I paired with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. They're based in Winnipeg and really trying to pair sort of Indigenous knowledge with Western knowledge and take the best of the best and see how we can sort of help give communities tools to, make differences from a landscape-based perspective in their own communities. Then the idea of critique, processing Downsview Park was sort of a critique of the promise of the competition of Downsview Park, and I think quite critical in this article in terms of the letdown of sort of what it became in the end. It was a very particular moment in landscape architecture theory about sort of a process-based approach to landscape. And I think just everything that happened there that's covered in the article didn't really happen. And then studio publications as well. So this would be an example of studio publication. This was a specific study on the old growth trees in Temagami. We took students up there. They kind of created all these maps and these beautiful models. And it was a lot of fun to be up there, especially in the winter, just crossing the ice road. And then we had this sort of exhibition style review. And the mapping is just like series and series of mapping that looks at like every kind of regional possibility in terms of where logging's happening. It was a lot of like data mining of information that's in spreadsheets and just trying to make it visual in a really cohesive way so that there could be an understanding of this particular region. And, it's great if things are in data sets, but unless you know GIS and know how to make it visual, it's lost in those data sets. So we really wanted to use that tool that landscape architects are really powerful at, is visual communication. And then these really, so taking that really sort of, precise data and then turning them into these kind of really conceptual ideas about thinking about how you can think about the region and how you can implement change that might be able to help Indigenous communities and the tree, protecting the trees. And then another tree protection, it was an attempt. We all know now what's happened at Ontario Place, but this was a study that basically, and George is going to be at this conference as well. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that there that's being held at U of T. But we were basically really trying to understand. I think there was a lot of understanding about the Zeidler's work and the buildings, the historic value of those. But a little bit less was known about the landscape. And George Baird, like so generously, basically said, "What money do you need? I want to fund you guys to prove that this landscape has cultural value." And the cultural value has a lot to do with the fact that Michael Huff was such a well-known global landscape architect. And so his work does have value. And so we were looking at, what was presumed to still be an existing Huff element. And I had students that just went out and took photographs and compared them to all the kind of existing maps and plans. And then there's like a whole kind of website where you can go in and check out all sorts of options of the trees, tree species, tree size, canopy size. So our MLA students and our forestry students, and I worked with the professor in forestry on this, went out and measured something like 800 trees to just sort of document them, which now I'm going to cry are pretty much all gone. But we made that attempt, and there may still be more that can be done. So I'm going to pass it on to Pete, and he's going to continue with his research.
Okay, I'm back. My research at the U of T for the past quite a while now has been in the realm of regenerative landscape technologies. I teach a course, an elective course, that looks at most often phytotechnologies, so the use of vegetation to remediate soil and groundwater. Um, Working with students, I also love to get things built. So we spend a lot of time inside, and within these courses, there's always an opportunity to build an installation. So within a few years ago, the landscape regeneration course, we paired with, again, the Jardin de Métis, the International Garden Festival in Gaspé. We have a really great relationship with them over the years. And the students had the opportunity to build a garden there. And the course was run in a way that the students would each research a technology, and then they would look at where design can fit into sort of an engineered solution, typically an engineered solution for remediation. So what we found within the course is typically the idea of soil remediation, groundwater remediation is the realm of engineers. And for us this semester, we're looking, where does the opportunity for design reside? So typically also these sites sit for a long time. So we're looking specifically at interim uses on brownfield sites and contaminated sites in urban environments. So students broke up into teams, and they had various subject matter. The winning team, we would vote throughout the semester, and we'd whittle it down to one scheme that everyone would sort of rally behind and build. So the winning scheme in this class was macro, micro, meso, and it was a use of mushrooms to remediate soil, contaminated soil. So how do you find design within that? The students were looking at coming up with an apparatus that would hold the soil, and something that could be directed in terms of exposure, orientation, cool, where the sun would hit it, where the shade would hit it, and looking at species of mushrooms that would thrive in those environments, and then targeting the contaminants. And then also, it would need to be something you could potentially occupy or experience, move through. And this was a great chance for the students to test these design ideas, and then build it, and then also have something that maybe was prefabbed and could be brought and installed elsewhere. So it was at the gardens for 2 summers, and then it was dismantled and brought to Ottawa, and was sort of moved around again. So it had sort of a prefab component to it, with the idea of treating contaminated soil on site. For a lot of students, this was the first time they were building, the first time they were sort of using a chop saw and figuring out joints and connections and the realities of building a small scale intervention. The next iteration, a few years later, similar idea. The students were working with winter stations, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the winter stations that are held in Ashbridges Bay each winter, I think from February through to the end of March. So it's typically midwinter. It's cold and windy and exposed out on Ashbridges Bay. And each group is given a site that sort of situates around a life-saving station. So we're given a site, but you're not given necessarily a focus. But we brought this through the course, and once again, we're looking at regenerating landscape regenerative systems, and the focus for this year was, for those of you that know Ashbridges Bay, the far east side is moving through a succession of successional planting and dune creation. That's often in the summer, it's sort of swept clean for other park uses. So we wanted to draw attention to the natural systems and the natural succession that was taking place on the western edge of the site, and to recognize that as a fairly special system that should be respected and potentially incorporated into the overall park design. So the scheme was to look at all of the species that were happening along the edge, rhodosier dogwood, birches, poplars, that would help to hold the sand, help for the dune creation to take place, and focus on that as a really beautiful layer within Ashbridges Bay. So the students made this amazing sort of viewing apparatus, if you will, that would house these natural systems. Again, a lot of them, it was the first time they were building. And you would, at first you would walk by and you may miss it. If you stopped and paused long enough, you could find just a sliver that you would look into, bring your attention towards what these plants were, and then you could find a little entry point, and then you would move in, and the landscape was there, and it was mirrored in on itself, and it would sort of expand that system. So it's almost an educational piece, and it was something to really showcase the spectacular vegetation that was happening that had been marginalized up to that point. Again, a temporary installation that I was going to say was used. There was also a fire pit next door, and I think some of these components were used for that. But it had to be fit within a budget. It's fairly inexpensive. It's about $5,000 or $10,000. So the students had to be super creative in terms of how they would construct and detail this installation. So this past summer, again, as part of the International Garden Festival, we were invited to look at almost the next phase for the Garden Festival. So the typical historic garden of the Jardin de Métis has the International Garden Festival as a component of that. Been there it was their 25th year. They were looking to expand into the community and play a role in some of the restoration of the natural systems in and around the garden. So the festival founder, Alexander Reeford, was working with the local community on a sand pit that was moving into the next phase of restoration. And typically in Quebec, a restoration of a sand pit is you sort of grade it flat and turn it back into agricultural land and sort of move on. This site was actually really spectacular, and something quite significant had taken place over the last few years with the leftover piles of sand. The bank swallow, which in Quebec is endangered, and 99% of its habitat had been eradicated, had found a home in this sort of spent sand pit, and the little pile of sand was in fact designated as an ecological significance and had to be left alone. So the students gravitated towards this and came up with an installation that would both direct attention towards that and would sort of educate in terms of the importance of retaining some of that landscape feature, and with the hopes of protecting that long term. To note that here's some of the students working away at it. To note that in the interim for the sand pit, it also was used as a dirt bike track for a lot of the local kids and residents. So we were afraid that once this was put in place, that this would become, they were going to drive over it and around it. But in fact, what we found was the week that they were installing it, the kids would drive by, they would stop, they would ask questions, and we would be able to point to them in terms of what the importance of retaining that landscape feature was, and to draw attention to it. So really a sort of a simple intervention, a viewing apparatus, a bird blind in a way, but also something that marks the next phase of the sand pit and recognizes sort of beauty in the left elements and not having the sort of the typical approach to sand quarry restoration, but maybe looking to the site for how it's functioning now and building on that condition a little bit. Right on time. The last research component I'd like to touch on, something that it's been ongoing for about 4 years now. The idea is this will be going on for indefinitely, hoping for the next sort of 10 to 20 years. And this is sort of near and dear to my heart, and this is phytoremediation I've been working on a site, a light industrial site out in Mississauga. It's about 10 acres in size. Sort of low levels of contamination, so nothing crazy serious, but enough that we can track the natural attenuation that is leaving the site to its own devices of natural succession over time, and looking at soil and groundwater, seeing if any improvements are being made, and then also targeting native species. So typically in phytoremediation to date, hybrid poplars and monocultures are used in phytoremediation. We thought, okay, well, what if we use native species primarily? We can contribute to, there's a creek that runs along, a Little Etobicoke Creek ravine just runs along adjacent to the site. So looking at some of those energies and processes and ecologies that would then migrate into the site, and looking to see how that could contribute to the site's remediation over time. So starting by planting swaths of native vegetation along the side that is adjacent to the creek, putting in a series of groundwater monitoring wells, taking tons and tons of soil samples. That was the start. And I thought, okay, well, that's exactly what we should be doing. The planting didn't thrive. In order for phytoremediation to be successful, the plants have to thrive. They have to be happy where they are. They have to grow really well. This was a really compacted, difficult site. So the next year we had a completely different approach, where things were starting to just move through natural succession on their own in a really beautiful way. So this is with a group of great students that were heading to site and doing all the testing and sampling and observations. And they thought, okay, well, let's just track what's going on right now in terms of vegetation. Yes, in terms of how the people that work at this facility maybe would rethink. It was a mown lawn to date, and this was transitioning from a mown lawn into something more diverse. Would they come out? Would they appreciate the messy craziness the site would become? And what sort of ecology might move back into the site in terms of wildlife, et cetera. So here the students are looking at some of the groundwater monitoring wells, doing a quadrat, looking at what plant species are moving in and tracking that. For those of you that know plant species, you'll see there's a lot of dog strangling vine, but that was short-lived, and we're moving into some pretty amazing phases in the last summer. The next was just making this process known and visible. So a lot of group planting events, people that worked at the facility would come out and contribute in terms of planting, learning about the process of phytoremediation. And of course, students in my class came out and would contribute as well. And then we have all sorts of things. We have cameras out that are documenting how the wildlife is moving in, rabbits, mice, coyotes, etc. And then looking at the soil and groundwater that is improving slowly over time as well. So that, in a nutshell, is research for the two of us, and we are currently coordinating first year Master of Landscape Architecture at U of T. This is our second year coordinating it as a team. We both taught various other studios, but this is sort of the first time we've been working together on it. And we are really, really passionate about finding form. And we know that as we're exposed to more and more and more precedents, design becomes more difficult, in our opinion. We don't just, it's all out there. To make a decision, to find your own voice, to look for form, and to be confident in terms of making design decisions. Actually, I find it more difficult now than ever before, because we have so much to compare ourselves to. So the studio really focuses on, how do you find form? Where do you look? How do you understand a site? And how do I find my own voice in an ocean of voices that are we have access to? So we have based the studio around Humber Bay Park, which some of you may know, just out at the west end of Toronto, which seems like a pretty massive site for first year. So we break it up into chunks. And the first chunk of the studio is looking at small scale installations. As you know, we love installations where you can get a strong concept and sort of research and come up with a really sort of a simple, strong design idea. The next iteration is looking at your feet, looking at the site for an embedded design language that you can use for inspiration. So the students are tasked with heading out into the field, taking photographs, doing sketches, looking at everything from small rocks and patterns to trees to larger maybe flows that may come through the site, looking for what the site, how it would speak to them. May sound a little bit, a little bit silly, but we find that getting out and looking at a site isn't always as easy as it might seem. And how do you sort of experience and what speaks to you with the site? So the students were asked to find pattern and form, and then they run it through an iteration, they tweak it based on a formula on an X and Y axis. So the first ink drawing is a direct translation of the pattern or form that they find, and they run it through whatever sort of system they want, whatever would skew it on the X, skew it on the Y axis. So some are predictable and some are not so predictable. So the idea is the form might emerge, but always in keeping with their original, their original interest on the site. From that, then they're asked to head back to the site, and they're given one smaller location within the larger Humber Bay Park. And how do you situate that form? It's a landform that they're asked to come up with, and that landform could do a few things. It could organize, program. It could catalyze ecologies on the site. It could be purely experiential. It could direct a view. It could work with stormwater management on the site. So they're not given a specific program, and that's sort of, again, a little bit stressful and a little bit overwhelming, but we find that it allows them to sort of think through and ask themselves some questions. So the landform becomes central in terms of their building that connection to site. So sketches, landform, and then placing it on the site on a specific location as a program catalyst or as an ecological catalyst. And then a lot of these students, this is sort of one of their first assignments, had never graded before, had never used a laser cutter before. So it's sort of the first opportunity to learn how to mold landscape, think about landform, and then think of the representation, and then also just the building of that landform in a site model. And then taking that, the phase that they're working at currently, we just ran from studio a few minutes ago for at the end of 6 o'clock is when we finish, at the end of the day. Now they're working on the master plan. So it starts small, a little bit bigger with landform, and now it's looking at a master plan for that site. So what holds that together as a framework? Still being able to go back to those ideas of form creation, pattern, and flow and circulation on the site that hopefully, at the end of the day, connects really strongly with the existing conditions of the site so that the site has a very site-specific response. And if I was to trace a line again through to our installations at the beginning, that's our passion, is to allow the site to always be legible, to always sort of trace back a connection to something that speaks to that specific location, process, flow, etc. So we're having fun moving through this right now. We've got a lot of work to do between now and the end of the semester, but the goal then is to hold this framework together with a language that is of their own and of the site. And then some of these projects were quite beautiful. This is from last year, quite beautiful in terms of connecting to natural systems. So this student, for example, was looking at frequency of birds that were moving through Humber Bay Park and the adjacent park network, tracking them, looking for opportunities to enhance that environment, but then looking for connections beyond as well. So this is looking at sort of stopover points. For those of you that are interested in birds, this is a really significant stopover in terms of a migration route. And again, similar to the swallows in Quebec, their habitat is really in decline. So how do you enhance that? And how do you have a sort of a public park? I would call it a metropolitan scale park that has thousands and thousands of people that are there on weekends and throughout the summer. And how do these two things coexist? How can you design for delicate and important ecologies, ecological systems, and then also really intensive program uses as a park on weekends and throughout the year? So always asking that question and trying to consider how do you find balance in that relationship. Other students were also looking at, again, always the question of balance, using circulation to define that, but then also using infrastructure to really not just be a singular focus. So this student had a really beautiful response in terms of having an elevated circulation system, circulation network that would allow for really intensive flows of bike and pedestrian and joggers, et cetera, to move through the site, but then also providing a framework for nesting birds and habitat for ecology. So how do you separate? It's not just running parallel, but she was looking at sort of extruding that from the site a little bit as well. So at the end of the day, she had a really spectacular approach to how you would allow both systems to thrive simultaneously, and then a model at the end, which I felt really brought it all together. So this was a bridge that she had 3D printed at the end of the day. So you move from the small scale intervention at the beginning, experimentation with form and pattern, and then how that ideally would be represented throughout in the design language of a larger scale park. And she found that within this bridge network, you could have little nesting cavities. You'd have this was totally born from the site, from site observations. And you would also have this beautiful bridge to facilitate flows for people and park users. So I think that brings us to the last slide. That's it. Thanks very much.
We used to teach landscape architecture here, and we have a second-year site course. And students are just discovering that contours are not just lines on a piece of paper, they have meaning. I took a group of students, fourth-year students, to Amherst Island, and everybody said, oh, the sites are flat. And then we actually went to, we had our contour maps, and the sites were not flat. They were 1 to 2 meters in slope. So it's really great to see your work, and thank you for your shout out too. What I wanted to say is that a lot of the students here are first year students, right? Who's in first year? Good. And so in our first year course, we talk about, I teach a course called The Built Context, and I talk about the way that we enter the discipline of architecture. And I use 4 different tropes. One of them is habitat. The other one is the human, the third is making, and the fourth is nature. And so this coming Wednesday is the nature group talking about this. And so I really was grateful to hear you talk about the essence of the site and the value of the site and how the site is actually very, very, very important in terms of generating ideas and also creating a sense of place, and also having the opportunity to exercise form and vision and opportunities for both ecological transformations, but also identity or cultural transformations. So this is just a comment because I just think it's fabulous to see your work. And so I often encourage our students to say, if you really are interested in landscape, I'm not going to necessarily pitch the Daniels faculty per se, although the program is fantastic, but the explorations and understanding plants and nature and systems, materials, the quality of places is really critical. And so your work is fantastic. And the opportunity that you're doing interventions and you're also publishing too on the history and also on issues, I think is really commendable. So I don't have a question for you, except it's so wonderful to see the kind of intensity, thoughtfulness, deliberate care, and also joy, I think, that you bring to your work. And that's something that when a student puts contours on a piece of paper and plunks their building on it, I say, well, how's that really working? How's that really working? And what does that really mean? So the site is very important, and where we build is very important. And I just personally am very grateful for the wonderful and thoughtful presentation that both of you made. Your maiden name was P-U-H-M, right?
Yeah.
Yes. I remember Alissa Pume, was that it?
Mhm,
So, in fourth year, I taught fifth year theory course and a fifth year thesis course. So it's really wonderful to see such a growth of both intellect, of capacity, and knowledge. And thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to turn George's comment into a question. So I mean, I agree. I think it's fantastic that you're here, and it's really exciting to see landscape and site expressed with such clarity, and to understand that opening your eyes and looking downward is a kind of a first step to acknowledging that. It is a persistent problem among students of architecture, but also architects, I think, to get them to think beyond the boundaries of their building, though. And I'm wondering, since you're in a faculty where you have architecture, you have urban design, and you have landscape, is there a kind of concerted effort to get architects to think about landscape as a vehicle for expressing ideas, as a source of inspiration, or perhaps with your clients too? How do these conversations take shape where you're working with other professionals and you're leading with landscape?
We always do that. We look at what, like, who would you want? Do you have an immediate? So in the Daniels faculty, we actually do have a very specific studio where all three disciplines get together, and they're not necessarily all doing all the disciplines, but they're very much working together to start to get that understanding of how disciplines influence one another. I think that's very important. I think for us, like personally, as landscape architects, and like you've maybe seen this as well, but when we first started in landscape architecture wasn't really that well known, and I think architects thought we just sort of did the planting once the building was done. And that still happens sometimes. Those are the architects you don't want to work with. But there are a lot of architects out there, that really do understand context and the importance of it. And so in our own working relationship, we're very conscious of working with architects that are happy to start collaborating right at the beginning of a project, so that it really is like a back and forth and things influence one another. And I think it for us and what we share with our students is it really is, it's not like you then have to do landscape architecture, or if you're a landscape architect, then you have to do architecture. Like that doesn't make sense. For me personally, I'm very much interested in our disciplinary expertise, but really understanding other disciplines and what they do and what they're good at, so that it's like, it's almost like as if they speak a different language, but as soon as you can speak their language, you can have a really interesting conversation. And so from that perspective, for us, it was study abroad. We went to study abroad. We went with the architects and the landscape architects together, and we saw both projects. And that was an amazing time to really, especially understand the other discipline. So if there's those travel opportunities, are great. But in studio, it's also that idea of learning how like multidisciplinary teams come together. We even have projects where there's two landscape architects on the team, because projects become big and they become complex, and people need even more expertise to see these things through. So
Just to maybe add a bit to that, I mean, the profession of landscape architect, it's also changed a whole lot since we were in undergrad. So that's a long time ago. And it was exactly that. It was that you're added to the project typically a little bit later, and it was for just more aesthetics than anything else. Now it's performance. How does it perform? And it's about city building. It's about green infrastructure. It's about so much more than it once was. It's amazing. And a lot of the projects that we were showing today in the public realm are moving through the city of Toronto, sort of grinding their way through a typical process. But what's really beautiful, and what I tell my students are really exciting, is that the reason we're brought on is because of the city of Toronto has expectations for, amazing work that is, if you look at, so Toronto green standards, for example, where the expectation is for green roofs have to perform in a certain way. Stormwater has to be managed in a specific way. Trees have to thrive and have to have specific amounts of soil volume to make them thrive. Up to, recently, you'd plant a tree in the city, any city, and it would last maybe 3 to 7 years at most. Now they have to be like really, really healthy, and you commit to that. So landscape architecture isn't added later. It's now just a part of city building, which is amazing. And what's super exciting, I think, is we have projects like the Portlands, which is a great example, which is led by landscape architects. And it's a really spectacular example of what the profession can do as leading sort of all these layers of city building. So it's changed a little bit over the last few years, but I think it's pretty exciting, for sure.
Are there any questions from students? Oh, yes, perfect.
So I know that Humber Bay Park is completely like infill, like it was man-made. So I was wondering how that impacts what you can grow there and even what you can build there.
That's a great question. That's where the landform comes in. So students are looking at like, what is it made of? And it's often fill. And when these sites were constructed, Ashbridges Bay, Humber Bay Park, Leslie Street Spit, it should be clean fill, but it's largely unknown at the time. It's from whatever they were building subway lines and then placing out there. So that what's growing there now isn't doing all that well. It's really sort of compacted and difficult condition. The landform is about how do you bring in soil volume? How can you organize program? And that's to get a sort of really healthy, thriving ecology despite the sort of really unknown compacted fill. So yeah, that's a big part of thinking that through. Yeah.
More about trees.
What do you want to know about?
Because
love
I think
trees.
trees are so important, and we tend to take them for granted.
That's true.
That's a tough question. Yes.
But to elaborate on that, George, I mean, it gets back to this problem of acknowledging beyond the boundaries of a building, right? Architects only think about soil when they have to dig a hole in it to build a basement or a parking garage. Landscape architects, I think, when they see a site, it's in cross-section automatically. So, I mean, thinking trees, yes, as an entry point, but thinking of site as a kind of layered space as well seems to be a feature of your work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like trees are they are what keep us alive on this planet. It's amazing. And so I think everything from, the work we were doing in Temagami in terms of really understanding old growth and the importance of intact ecosystems is really critical, but even down to city trees. And so, an intact ecosystem is, it's thriving and it's regenerating in the city. We're doing everything we can to support trees. So on every project, it's like, what's your soil volume? How deep can you get? The City of Toronto Green Standards has requirements for soil volumes. You have to meet them on site to be able to even plant one tree. And those are all good things. We personally think the city could plant more trees and they would probably do all right. They sort of have their minimal limits and we're always trying to get in more. But absolutely critical in terms of thinking of that. It's the canopy, it's urban, heat island effect, it's biodiversity, it's helped with pollution, like in urban conditions, they're incredible. And when they're working in communities, it's basically what's keeping this planet from burning. So it's like absolutely critical. And to think of any opportunity you have to give, more room to the streetscape, or even to be thinking of the conditions of your building. Are you creating your building in a way that then it can have a proper green roof? Soil is heavy. There are other light soil opportunities to be doing green roofs and so forth. But a green roof, like fine if you just put like a small layer of planting, but if you really want to create green architecture, you're looking at like really a whole new level of structure to be able to accommodate that. So these are all things that, I think we can really think about our cities as ecosystems. And so, how we're working together to get to this end where it's going to really be impactful, I think is really critical. So yeah, trees are amazing. Yeah. Thank you.
When designing, do you ever take into consideration the growth cycle of trees or plants and play with that to create a different visual impact or feeling in each season?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's critical from the perspective of understanding what things are going to look over over the seasons, but also over time, and to really, be thinking what are the objectives. So, street trees are sort of like they get planted, they grow, and then they eventually die. That's kind of the life of a street tree. But when you start to plant trees in communities, they thrive and can regenerate in different ways. So we're always thinking about scale in terms of what's the most you can do on sort of this scale of site. But definitely always thinking and seeing that through time, which is kind of a bit in terms of certain things that I've been playing around with in terms of research is getting into like the visualization of that change over time so that we can really understand that it's not just the stick with the circle on the top that stays the same size. It's really, really critical.
Any further questions? Otherwise, I will keep asking questions. Oh, perfect.
Thanks. Regarding the episode that you mentioned regarding the McMichael and your interaction with the maintenance people brings up other profession, their role in relation to other professions besides the designers. In that case, the maintenance people, but also the green standards who kind of at the other answer sort of you spoke about positively in terms of pushing things forward, but the maintenance people, it was more kind of a negative thing. But ultimately, kind of once you step away, once it's there and you move away from the site, how does that fit into your thinking of what happens once it's left alone?
That's probably that's one of the
How do you design for that?
that's one of the trickiest thing about being a landscape architect is that you can actually visit your sites. If you're an architect, they can lock the door and keep you out. You don't know how they're maintaining it. As a landscape architect, I always do drive-bys and I make sure and I see what's working, what's not. But what's happening more and more with sort of larger, more complex sites that have sort of beautiful, rich vegetation as a key component is that typically the client would ask for, you would suggest, or we would suggest and weave it into the project as a whole as a maintenance manual or maintenance regime that they would look to for guidance over the years. Because typically you would finish a project, you would hand it over, and then there's not a whole lot, like, maybe a few things to water it on occasion, but as they become more important, more integrated into, and where performance is a consideration and a requirement, in fact, a maintenance regime and a maintenance manual is really, really important. I think one of the best examples maybe in our city is Corktown Common, which is just a stunning landscape by MVVA, Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates. And that was constructed to do a few things, but one of them is just to be really thoughtful with amazing vegetative palette. With that, there's a manual that is the size of an old phone book essentially that the city can refer to in terms of soil, in terms of just vegetation maintenance, but everything from the soil up essentially. So it's not just the trees, but it's all in terms of fertilizing or what. So everything, compaction, you name it. So it's all the layers that go into making that a successful landscape over time, so that it thrives. It doesn't just exist, but it thrives. And that was I think a really a turning point in the city when that project was finished, and that manual was a requirement. So there are some great examples of that. Not every project has that, but that's ultimately the goal for sure.
Oh, we did a similar thing for McMichael because they knew it would go through cycles and they were trying to transform the whole property. And so, I mean, talking to the maintenance people was part of it, but there was a document that was basically outlining, particularly because there were areas of meadow restoration as well. So it has to sort of go through a certain maintenance process to be able to maintain certain types of ecology. So in that particular project, we were almost more calling it like curated ecologies, which worked well with the gallery, because it's not like it's just going to eventually go through a natural succession. It is sort of being maintained to a certain degree. But yeah, we're looking at that a lot more. It's the scale of the project as well. Sort of makes a difference in terms of the investment of maintenance over time.
Okay, so you talked a lot about the scientific benefits of adding trees onto sites and how it's keeping our world from basically burning. But what can you conclude as like adding a tree on a site? What can you conclude will have the most benefits to our like human experience as like a sense of dwelling in that space? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of people have done studies on this too. It's quite interesting. The more trees you have, or if you have a view of a tree, they like equate that to like less crime, like a lot of calmness. So even certain trees, like if you walk through forests, they sort of emit chemicals that actually will calm you down. You've probably heard of forest bathing. That's kind of, well, people walk through forests just to like calm themselves down. And it's not just because you're going for a walk. There's actually like it's pining that the trees are emitting a chemical that actually like changes how we think and feel. And so these are things that, I think could be studied more, but basically there are huge benefits that way. Even just shade, like the shade is fantastic. Trees absorb pollution from the atmosphere. Even just dust, the leaves will hold on to the dust, and then when it rains, they'll sort of wash off in that way. So there's just so many benefits. It's psychological connection, human connection to just green. And it's critical to sort of happiness and well-being. Absolutely.
So, I mean, I might just ask one more. I'm an historian, and one of my interests is in shifts in education and how that produces thought in practitioners over the years. And I mean, you're both products of the GSD, and you've had enough time now. I think, is it fair to reflect on the GSD and the way you speak about landscape to me is very reminiscent of some of the conversations that were happening at that school at that particular juncture. So perhaps in addition to George, perhaps you could single out some of the thinkers there that have impacted your practice moving forward as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I was at the GSD, George Hargraves was there. Actually, after I graduated from U of T, I went to go work with him because I was so interested in his perspective on process-based landscapes. Which then I actually get I'd like joke around with him, like, why did you give that up? Now you're all about landform. But definitely I thought that level of thinking, and George helped me through that in terms of my thesis. I was really interested in that idea of how landscapes change over time. And that was sort of a very new thread of thought then. And so, yeah, that would have been influential. But I think there's also, the whole group of professors there, Martha Schwartz, Michael Van Valkenburg, George Hargraves, they were all there when we were there. The really early they were the shift into like postmodernism in terms of landscape architecture. And there was something about them to see them be able to handle design, like form so adeptly because of a kind of, I don't know, a trust in your talent, and then also teach. I think they were models to us in terms of the idea that you could actually be a professor and also practice. Um, so it was more than just like a product of that time of thinking, but even just modeling like how to have a career, I think was pretty amazing as well. Did you want? Eric Hildebrand?
I mean, it was also, yeah, the GSD was, primarily professors in practice. So it wasn't just sort of teaching something from a distance. It was like teaching from experience. And for us, that was really, really critical for setting an example and learning. I think someone that was really, really important was Richard Foreman as well. So an ecologist, a landscape ecologist that taught within the architecture and landscape faculty. So he was able to communicate complex ideas in really simple diagrams in a language that was accessible to everyone, and not just accessible, but really, interesting and important. And I took his field course. We went to New Mexico and sort of wandered through the desert, looking at animal tracks and looking for, patches and networks that were connected or disconnected. And I think about that almost every project that I've worked on from. So someone like that was really sort of sparked a whole new way of thinking about landscape connectivity and performance. But yeah, so those are a few.
I think we've reached the end. I think we've all been teaching studio all day and lecturing on top of it, and we're tired and hungry now. Can everybody please join me in thanking one more time Alissa and Pete North for joining us tonight?